I love you.
I was not supposed to be at the party, not in the way everyone else was. Technically, I was inside the ballroom, wearing a suit that still felt like it belonged to a better paid man, holding a glass of water I had not taken a single sip from in 40 minutes. But I was working. That was the difference. Other people were there to celebrate 40 years of Ashford and Lane events, to compliment the flowers, to take pictures under the gold anniversary banner, to tell Charles Ashford that no one in Charleston hosted a company party quite like his family did. I was there to make sure the microphone did not squeal during his speech, the shrimp trays stayed full, the valet team did not lose anyone's keys, and the jazz quartet understood that soft background music did not mean funeral with saxophones. That was my job. Operations coordinator sounded cleaner on business cards, but most nights it meant standing at the edge of expensive rooms, quietly preventing rich people from noticing problems. My name is Nolan Briggs, and by 34, I had become very good at being useful without becoming visible. There is an art to it. You learn where to stand so people can find you when they need something, but forget you when the photos start. You learn to smile when someone calls you reliable, like it is the highest compliment a man can earn. You learn to carry tape, safety pins, painkillers, backup charger cables, 2 pens, and the private belief that wanting more than your assigned corner is how trouble starts. Ashford and Lane was a family company, which meant loyalty was treated like a virtue until it became a leash. Charles Ashford trusted me. He said it often. Nolan can handle it. Nolan knows the schedule. Nolan will make sure this does not become a situation. I had built a whole life around making sure things did not become situations. Then Vivian Ashford walked in alone, and the room became one anyway. I saw the reaction ripple before I saw her clearly. A pause near the bar, 2 women turning their heads. Charles looking toward the entrance and freezing for half a second before recovering with a host's smile. Vivian had been gone for a few months in Atlanta, officially working on brand partnerships, unofficially ending an engagement everyone had already treated like a merger. Graham Tate was there that night too, of course, because men like Graham never missed events where they might be mistaken for important furniture. He stood near a cluster of sponsors in a charcoal suit, looking handsome in the expensive, polished way that made every expression seem practiced in a mirror. Vivian entered without him. That was enough for people to notice. She wore a deep green dress, simple but impossible to ignore, her dark hair pinned low, her face calm in a way that cost something. She looked like a woman who had decided not to explain herself and knew everyone would punish her for it politely. I looked away first. That was habit. Vivian Ashford was my boss's daughter, the company's brand director, and the kind of woman men like me learned to admire with professional distance. We had worked together for 4 years. She knew I hated last-minute floor plan changes. I knew she took her earrings off when she was overwhelmed and put them in the left pocket of her blazer. She knew I counted vendor exits in every venue. I knew she could turn a client's vague complaint into a graceful thank you email that sounded like silk wrapped around a brick. We were friendly, careful, good at standing on opposite sides of invisible lines. At least, I thought we were. Then she crossed the room, caught my eye near the service entrance, and smiled like I was not part of the wallpaper. That was the first mistake of the night, though not hers. The second mistake came during Charles's speech. He thanked clients, partners, staff, family, old friends, new friends, people who had trusted Ashford and Lane with their weddings, galas, retirements, charity auctions, and second marriages that cost more than most first homes. Everyone laughed at the right moments. I stood near the sound table, nodding to the technician when the wireless mic held steady. Then, Charles announced the old founder family dance, a tradition I had somehow never been close enough to be trapped by. The band shifted into something slow and warm. Couples began moving toward the floor. Charles looked toward Vivian. Vivian looked back at him, still smiling, but I saw the tiny pause. Graham was watching too. So were half the people who remembered the engagement photos, the engagement party, the future they had, all decided looked good in print. Charles moved fast when appearances started to wobble. He crossed to Vivian with that public father smile that said everything was fine because he had decided it would be. I could not hear the first words, but I saw Vivian's jaw tighten. Then Charles turned, scanned the room, and found me. I knew that look. It meant Nolan can handle it. It meant there was a gap in the machinery of the night, and I was about to become the part shoved into place. He came toward me, one hand already lifting in a friendly summons. "Nolan," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "come save my daughter from having to dance with her old man twice in one evening." People chuckled. Harmless. Charming. A father teasing. A boss asking. An order dressed as a joke. I said, "Sir, I'm working," because apparently I still believed facts had power in formal rooms. Charles clapped a hand on my shoulder and said that was why he trusted me. Then, softer, with his host smile still fixed, he added, "You're the safest man in the room." Safe. There it was, a compliment with the door locked from the outside. I looked past him at Vivian. She was watching me, and there was something in her expression I could not read quickly enough to protect myself from. Amusement, maybe. Apology. Challenge. I should have found an excuse. The caterer needed me, the lighting board was unstable, the building was on fire in some tasteful and invisible way. Instead, I walked onto the dance floor because I was very good at being asked. Vivian placed her hand in mine like she was giving me a secret and daring me not to drop it. I put my other hand at her back carefully, too carefully, with enough space between my palm and the warmth of her dress to satisfy every rule I had ever invented. She noticed immediately. Of course she did. "Nolan," she said, her voice low enough that only I could hear, "you are holding me like I might accuse you of stealing silver." I almost laughed, which was dangerous because laughing with Vivian always made the room feel smaller. I told her I was trying not to get fired at my employer's anniversary party. She said her father had practically thrown me into her arms, which was not helping my concentration. I told her my concentration was excellent. She glanced down at our feet. "You're counting steps." I stopped counting. She smiled, not mockingly, not kindly, in a way that let me off easy. "You count everything," she said. "Exits, schedules, problems. I didn't know you counted yourself out too." That line landed harder than it should have, especially in a room full of people pretending not to watch us. The band moved through the slow song. Charles looked relieved. Graham looked amused in a way I wanted to ignore. And Vivian stayed close enough that my hand at her back stopped feeling formal, no matter how hard I tried to make it behave. I told her she had a hard night and I was only helping. She looked up at me then, eyes steady, mouth soft, with something that was not quite a smile. "Is that what you call this?" she asked. I did not answer. I could not. The song should have ended sooner. It should have let me step back, nod politely, return to the edge of the room where men like me knew how to breathe. But when the final notes began to stretch, Vivian's fingers tightened around mine. I started to let go because that was the correct thing to do, the safe thing, the professional thing. Then she leaned just close enough for her whisper to reach me beneath the applause. "Don't let go yet." For one suspended second, the ballroom disappeared around us. I still heard the clapping, the band, Charles's relieved laugh somewhere behind her, but none of it touched the space between my hand and her back. Vivian did not look away. She did not pretend the words had come out by accident, and I realized, with the kind of quiet panic that changes a man's life, that this dance was no longer a favor. When the song ended, Nolan did what he always did when a room got too honest. He stepped back. Not abruptly enough to embarrass Vivian, not quickly enough for anyone watching to call it rude, but fast enough that the warmth of her hand slipped from his before it could become something people might name. Around them, applause faded into polite conversation. Charles Ashford was already laughing with a sponsor near the edge of the dance floor, satisfied that the awkward moment had been smoothed over. Graham Tate lifted his glass from across the room with a small smile that looked friendly only if a person had never been insulted by a man in a tailored suit. Vivian noticed that smile, then noticed Nolan noticing it, and her fingers caught the edge of his sleeve before he could disappear back toward the sound table. He looked down at her hand first. That was safer than looking at her face. Vivian's touch was light, almost formal, but it stopped him as cleanly as if she had spoken his name across an empty room. She said she needed a minute away from all the smiling, and before Nolan could decide whether that was a request, an excuse, or a terrible idea, she was guiding him toward the side of the ballroom. They slipped past a curtain of white florals, through a service door, and into the narrow hallway behind the event space where the music became muffled and the air smelled faintly of coffee, brass polish, and folded table linens. Nolan knew that hallway well. He knew the breaker panel near the pantry, the uneven tile by the staff entrance, the door that stuck unless someone lifted the handle. He knew useful things. Standing there with Vivian Ashford still holding his sleeve, he had never felt less useful in his life. Vivian let go first, but not because she looked ready to. She leaned one shoulder against the wall and studied him with the kind of calm that made easy answers feel insulting. She thanked him for the dance, but the words did not sound like a boss's daughter thanking an employee for helping her father manage appearances. They sounded personal, almost private. Nolan said it was no problem, which was exactly the wrong thing to say, and he knew it as soon as her eyebrow lifted. She asked if every uncomfortable moment in his life got filed under no problem, and he told her it was an efficient system. Vivian's mouth curved, but her eyes stayed serious. She said, "You looked like you were trying to apologize for touching me." He answered that keeping his job and dental insurance seemed like a worthy goal. That earned him a small laugh, but it did not rescue him. She stepped away from the wall and crossed her arms. Not defensively, more like she was holding herself together while deciding how much truth the hallway deserved. She told him he always did that. He always turned himself into the safest version of a man in the room, then acted surprised when people treated him like furniture with good judgment. Nolan said that was a very poetic insult for someone who had just dragged him into a service corridor. Vivian said she was not insulting him. She was tired of watching him vanish while everyone praised him for it. That landed too close to the place he kept locked. He glanced toward the ballroom door, where the party continued without them, and said she had already had a hard night. He did not want to make it harder by confusing things. Vivian's expression shifted. Not softer, exactly. Sharper in a sad way. She asked why he assumed wanting something would automatically make him dangerous. Nolan had no quick answer for that. He had spent 4 years building careful walls around every moment with her. Around the late nights when they reviewed floor plans alone. Around the mornings when she came in with coffee and removed her earrings before a difficult client call. Around every almost laugh, every almost confession, every second when he sensed she was tired of being the beautiful face of a family company and wanted someone to ask what it cost her. Wanting her had never felt simple. It had felt like standing too close to a line drawn by money, power, family, and his own stubborn belief that men like him should be grateful for being trusted, not foolish enough to ask for more. He told her it was not about danger, it was about respect. Vivian looked at him for a long moment, then said, respect did not usually look so much like running away. The words were quiet enough not to wound on purpose, but they found him anyway. Nolan looked down the hall toward a cart stacked with extra champagne flutes because it was easier than looking at her. He said her father had asked him to dance because he was safe. He did not say how much he hated that word. He did not say it made him feel like a locked cabinet where people stored emergencies, but Vivian heard the unsaid part. She always seemed to hear the unsaid part. She said her father called him safe because Charles liked anything he could depend on without having to understand it. Then she added, more quietly, that she had not asked him not to let go because he was safe. That should have been the moment Nolan said something honest. Instead, the ballroom door opened at the far end of the hall. Graham Tate stepped out with a phone in his hand and paused when he saw them. His smile arrived half a second too late to be innocent. He asked if he was interrupting a staff meeting, and Vivian's posture changed so quickly Nolan felt the shift before he understood it. She became polished again. Not false, not exactly, but guarded. Nolan recognized the performance because he had seen it on the ballroom floor. Vivian told Graham they were discussing a timing issue with the program. Graham looked from her to Nolan's sleeve, where her hand had been moments before, and said he was sure Nolan was excellent with timing. The words were harmless on paper. In his voice, they were not. Nolan answered before Vivian could. He said the revised program was already handled and that Graham should enjoy the party. It was polite, clean, and empty of every sharper thing Nolan wanted to say. Graham's smile widened, as if politeness proved something. He told Vivian her father was looking for her, then disappeared back into the ballroom with the lazy confidence of someone who knew he had left dirt on the floor for other people to clean. The hallway stayed quiet after the door closed. Vivian's jaw tightened. Nolan could see her trying to decide whether to be angry, embarrassed, or exhausted. He hated Graham for making her choose. He hated himself a little for not saying more. Vivian turned back to him and said that was exactly what she meant. Nolan asked what she meant, though he already knew he would not like the answer. She said he had a way of taking insults and polishing them into silence. He told her not every insult deserved a scene. She agreed, then said not every feeling deserved a burial either. For a second, neither of them moved. The music behind the wall shifted into something faster, brighter, easier for people who belonged in ballrooms. Vivian's gaze dropped to his hand, the one that had been at her back during the dance, then lifted again. She said he could let go every time something felt real if he wanted to, but he should stop calling it respect when it looked so much like fear. Nolan stood there in the service hallway with the party moving on without him, and for the first time all night, he did not know where to put himself. The ballroom needed him. Charles trusted him. Graham was watching. Vivian was standing close enough to make every professional rule feel suddenly thin. He should have walked back in. He should have checked the microphone, the caterers, the schedule, anything with a problem he could solve. But Vivian did not move toward the door, and neither did he. The next workday, I tried to turn myself back into the version of Nolan Briggs who knew where every extension cord was and did not spend office hours thinking about Vivian Ashford's hand on his sleeve. It went badly. By 8:15, I had already fixed a loading schedule error, found a missing crate of table runners, calmed down a florist who believed a delivery driver had personally betrayed her, and reset the warehouse printer twice because apparently technology enjoyed watching me lose faith in civilization. Normal problems, useful problems. The kind I could solve without wondering what a woman meant when she whispered, "Don't let go yet," in a ballroom full of people who thought they understood the room better than she did. I told myself the party was over, the dance was over, the hallway was over. Vivian had been dealing with a hard night, Graham had been circling like a polished shark, and I had been the nearest decent man available. That explanation should have helped. It did not. The warehouse office sat behind the showroom, separated from the pretty side of Ashford and Lane by a hallway lined with framed photographs of events we had made look effortless. On the showroom side, clients saw sample centerpieces, linen swatches, mood boards, and soft lighting that made them believe their problems would arrive pre-solved. On our side, there were folding chairs, scuffed floors, invoices, toolkits, spare bulbs, 3 kinds of tape, and a coffee machine that sounded like it was trying to confess a crime. That was where I belonged. I knew how to move there. I knew which drawer stuck and which intern forgot to label inventory correctly. I knew how to be necessary without being considered central. Then Vivian walked in, carrying 2 coffees and a leather folder of event photos, and the whole office suddenly felt like it had been caught wearing old clothes. She looked less formal than she had at the party, but somehow more dangerous to my concentration. Navy slacks, cream blouse, hair pinned loosely instead of perfectly, small gold earrings she had not yet taken off. I noticed the earrings because I noticed too much around Vivian and then pretended it was logistics. She set 1 coffee on my desk and said, "Black, 1 sugar, because you only pretend to like suffering." I stared at the cup like it might explain itself. She told me I had once made that exact coffee during a 6 a.m. venue load-in and then looked personally offended when someone offered me vanilla creamer. I said I did not know my beverage choices were being monitored by senior leadership. She smiled and said leadership had many burdens. It was easy, for about 3 seconds, to pretend we were only teasing each other. Then her gaze dropped to the papers on my desk, the vendor correction list, the handwritten floor plan notes, the half-repaired badge printer beside my elbow, and her smile faded into something more observant. She said, "You already fixed 3 things no one will know were broken." I told her that was the point of operations. If people noticed me, something had probably gone wrong. Vivian leaned against the doorframe and gave me a look that reminded me too much of the hallway. "You say that like it's a professional philosophy," she said. "I think it's a hiding place." I picked up a pen because holding something made it easier not to answer. I told her she had come to review photos, not diagnose my personality. She said multitasking was part of her job description. Then she opened the folder and spread a few printed shots across my desk. The anniversary party, all warm lights and polished smiles, Charles giving his speech, sponsors laughing. Vivian standing near the floral arch alone, beautiful and composed enough that anyone who did not know better would think she was fine. Then there was one photo I wish she had not brought. The dance floor, my hand at her back, her face turned slightly up toward mine, and me looking like a man trying to survive a compliment. I reached to slide the photo back into the folder, but Vivian placed 2 fingers on the corner and stopped me. Not dramatically, just enough. She said the photographer had caught the exact second before I stepped away. I told her photographers were criminals with good lenses. She laughed softly, but her fingers stayed on the paper. I said her father had needed a clean solution in a public moment, and I happened to be standing nearby. Vivian looked at me then, and the teasing left her face. "You were not nearby," she said. "You were chosen because my father knew you would not make trouble." That should have made me feel respected. Instead, it made me feel like a doorstop with a pension plan. I admitted, more quietly than I intended, that useful people were allowed into rooms they did not belong in. Her expression changed, not with pity, but with recognition so precise it made me uncomfortable. She asked if that was really how I saw myself here. I wanted to say no. I wanted to give the loyal employee answer, the grateful answer, the one Charles would have approved of if he were standing in the doorway. Instead, I looked through the glass wall toward the showroom, where sunlight hit the expensive table settings we use to sell people on perfect evenings, and I told her some rooms taught you quickly where the edges were. I grew up around families who hired companies like Ashford and Lane, but never sat with the people who carried the chairs. My mother cleaned offices downtown, my father drove delivery trucks until his back gave out, and I learned early that being competent got you invited closer than wanting ever would. Competent was safe. Competent was respectable. Competent did not embarrass anyone. Vivian listened without interrupting, and that was worse than being challenged. It let the words keep going. I said I had built a career out of standing near doors, making sure everyone else could move through them smoothly. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she knew something about rooms that only wanted one version of you. Her voice did not crack, but it lost some polish. She told me the engagement with Graham had been over privately long before it ended publicly. Months, maybe longer, depending on whether she counted the first time. She realized she was relieved when he canceled dinner. She had stayed because leaving would have disappointed her father, confused the sponsors, complicated the family story, and forced everyone to admit the beautiful plan had been empty. Then she looked at the dance photo and said she had noticed me before she was free. Not in some dramatic, reckless way. Not in a way she was proud of acting on, because she had not acted on it. But she had noticed the way I stood near exits, the way I told clients the truth carefully instead of flattering them badly. The way I disappeared after solving a crisis, like staying for thanks, would be greedy. I did not know what to do with that. Being insulted was easier. Being dismissed was familiar. Being seen by Vivian was like having someone open a curtain in a room I had convinced myself was storage. I said she was engaged then. She nodded. "I know," she said. "That's why I kept it to myself." There was no flirtation in the sentence, and somehow that made it more intimate. She said she would not turn me into a secret, and she would not turn herself into someone who looked for an exit before closing the door she was already standing in. I respected that so much it made my chest hurt. I wanted to tell her that, but before I found the words, Charles Ashford walked into the warehouse office with his phone in one hand and his event smile missing. He paused when he saw Vivian at my desk, then recovered quickly enough that most people would not have noticed the calculation. I noticed because noticing was my job. Charles said he was glad we were both there because Bennett Cole from Larkspur Development, Graham's newest sponsor connection, naturally had a last-minute problem with the waterfront gala proposal and needed someone steady to smooth it out. Then he looked directly at me and added with complete confidence, "Nolan, you're the one man I trust to keep this family out of trouble." The words were meant as praise. Vivian heard them differently. So did I. And for the first time, being trusted felt less like honor and more like another room I was not allowed to leave. The waterfront venue was one of those places Charleston liked to pretend had always been elegant, even though half the charm came from old brick, expensive lighting, and the careful hiding of everything practical. By late afternoon, the harbor was gray-blue through the tall windows, the tables were half-dressed in ivory linens, and the chandeliers hung dim above a floor that would look magical once guests arrived and impossible until then. I was there because Charles had asked me to handle the sponsor issue, which turned out to be less of an issue and more of a rich man wanting to be reassured that his logo would appear in the correct places without looking like he cared too much. I fixed it in 20 minutes. Then I stayed another hour because staying after fixing things was apparently what I did when I did not know how to leave my own feelings alone. Vivian was there too, reviewing the visual layout near the stage with a tablet in one hand and her earrings already gone from her ears. They sat in her blazer pocket, probably, because I had become the kind of man who knew that and hated himself a little for it. She saw me checking the side entrance, then the lighting truss, then the stage steps, and finally she said, "Do you ever enter a room without planning how to survive it?" I told her, "Only grocery stores? And even then, I like to know where the cereal aisle was." She smiled, but it did not last. We had spent the whole day circling the conversation from the office, the dance photo still somewhere between us, even though neither of us mentioned it. I could feel her patience thinning, not with anger exactly, but with the exhaustion of a woman watching me turn every honest moment into a work assignment. When the vendor team stepped outside to unload another crate of glassware, we were alone in the ballroom. The room was not finished yet, which made it feel more honest. Chairs stacked against one wall, boxes of candles on the floor, a half-built dance area waiting for people who would arrive later, dressed beautifully and never think about the men who taped down the cords so they would not trip. Vivian walked to the edge of the empty floor and looked down at it. "You disappeared after the party," she said. I told her I had been at work every day. She looked back at me. "That's your favorite disguise." I wanted to laugh it off, but the room was too empty for easy jokes to land. So I said I had not wanted to make things harder for her. Vivian's face softened in a way that made me brace. "You keep saying that," she said, "like my life becomes easier every time you step away." I crossed my arms because my hands did not know what to do. I told her there were lines for a reason. Her father was my boss. She was still dealing with Graham and the public mess of ending an engagement. The company was built on reputation, and I had no interest in being another problem she had to manage. Vivian listened, then set her tablet on a nearby table and walked closer, slow enough that I could have moved if I wanted to prove my own point. I did not move. She stopped in front of me and said, "You are not a problem, Nolan, but you keep making your feelings sound like one." I looked at the empty dance floor instead of her. That was a mistake, because it brought back the party, her hand in mine, the whisper that had followed me into every quiet moment since. "Don't let go yet." She noticed where I was looking. Of course she did. "Would you dance with me if no one made you?" she asked. It was not flirtatious, not exactly. It was worse than flirtation because it asked for truth. I said this was a setup, and she said it was a ballroom, so technically, yes. I smiled despite myself, and for half a second we were back in that dangerous rhythm where everything between us had a pulse under it. She stepped onto the empty dance floor and held out one hand. No music, no audience, no father smiling with relief, no Graham watching like he owned the story, just Vivian, waiting. I wanted to take her hand so badly it felt almost physical. Instead, I stayed where I was and said her name like an apology. Her hand lowered slowly. She did not look humiliated, that would have been easier. She looked like she understood exactly why I had refused and was tired of understanding it. Before either of us could say the thing that would have changed the afternoon completely, Charles came in through the side doors with 2 venue managers behind him. His timing was so perfect it felt rehearsed by the universe. Vivian stepped back. I picked up a clipboard I did not need. Charles glanced between us, and I saw the pause, the quick father's calculation, the boss's assessment, the man trained by decades of events to recognize when a room had shifted. He handled the venue questions first, calm and efficient. Then he asked Vivian to check with the floral team outside. She looked at him, then at me, and for 1 second I thought she might refuse purely on principle. Instead, she took her tablet and walked out, leaving the room colder than before. Charles waited until the venue managers were gone. Then he stood beside me at the edge of the unfinished dance floor, hands in his pockets, looking out over the room like we were discussing table placement and not the invisible line I had almost crossed. He said Vivian had been through a great deal lately. I said I knew. He said Graham had complicated things, the engagement had complicated things, and public perception had a nasty habit of turning private confusion into permanent damage. I said nothing, because every answer available sounded either defensive or guilty. Charles finally looked at me. His voice was not cruel. That somehow made it heavier. "I trust you, Nolan," he said. "I respect you." But Vivian is vulnerable right now, and I need to know you understand the difference between being there for her and letting her mistake steadiness for something else. There are insults that announce themselves. That one did not. It wore concern like a clean shirt. I told him I would never take advantage of his daughter. Charles nodded, almost relieved, and said he knew that was why he was saying this to me instead of anyone else. I understood what he meant. He trusted my restraint more than he trusted my heart. Maybe I had taught him to. Maybe everyone had learned to count on me staying exactly where they placed me because I had been so careful never to ask who drew the map. Charles put a hand on my shoulder and said, "You're a good man." It should have felt like praise. Instead, it felt like being locked out of a room while holding the key. Vivian found me near the service entrance 10 minutes later, after Charles had gone to charm the venue director and I had managed to look very busy with a roll of tape. She did not waste time. "What did he say?" I told her it was nothing. Her eyes narrowed. "Nolan, I pulled a strip of tape too hard and tore it crooked. Then I said nothing that wasn't true." The hurt that crossed her face was small, but I saw it, and that made it worse. She stepped closer, voice low enough that no one outside the hallway could hear. "So, that's it? My father decides what my feelings mean, and you help him call it wisdom?" I wanted to tell her no. I wanted to tell her I was trying to protect her, protect my job, protect the fragile ground beneath us. But all I said was that I was trying to do the right thing. Vivian looked at me for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet enough to cut. "Then maybe someday you'll ask yourself, who keeps benefiting from your version of right?" She walked back into the ballroom before I could answer, leaving me with the tape in my hand, the empty dance floor in front of me, and the ugly realization that I had not protected her from anything. I had only made sure I was the first one to let go. Vivian found me after hours in the storage hall behind the warehouse, which was where Ashford and Lane sent every beautiful thing once it stopped being useful enough to display. Old floral arches wrapped in plastic leaned against one wall. Retired dance floor panels were stacked in careful squares near the back. Boxes of brass candle holders, folded linens, fake greenery, cracked frames, and forgotten centerpieces crowded the shelves like evidence from other people's perfect nights. I was there pretending to inventory table numbers because pretending had apparently become my most consistent skill. The warehouse was quiet except for the buzz of the overhead lights and the distant hum of traffic beyond the loading dock. I knew she was there before she spoke. Maybe it was the faint click of her heels on concrete. Maybe it was the way the air changed when someone entered a room with no intention of letting you escape it. She did not open with my name. That would have been too easy. She stood a few feet away, arms folded, eyes tired and bright, in that way they got when she was done being handled carefully. "I am so tired," she said, "of men holding meetings about what my feelings mean." I put down the clipboard, slowly, like sudden movement might make the whole room collapse. She said Graham thought her feelings were embarrassment. Charles thought they were vulnerability. I seemed determined to call them timing, risk, respect, professionalism, or whatever other word would let me walk backward without admitting I was leaving. I told her I was not trying to leave. Even as I said it, I knew how weak it sounded. Vivian looked at the stacked dance floor panels beside us and gave a small, humorless smile. "Nolan, you have turned leaving into an art form. You do it while standing perfectly still." That one landed clean. I had no joke ready, or maybe I was finally too tired to reach for one. I told her I did not know how to do this without causing damage. She stepped closer, not much, but enough that the old rules started waking up in my head again. Boss's daughter, family company, recently ended engagement, Charles's warning, Graham's smirk. My job, my pride, the invisible line between being trusted and being presumptuous. Vivian listened while I listed none of it out loud because she already knew the list. That was the thing about her. She did not need me to explain the fence. She wanted to know why I kept kneeling beside it like it was a church. I said people would say I forgot my place. Her expression softened then, but not in a gentle way. More like she had found the bruise and hated that it had been there so long. "Your place?" she said quietly. "Do you hear yourself?" I did. That was the problem. I heard myself sounding like every person who had ever made desire feel like overreaching. I looked at the old dance panels, their glossy black surfaces scuffed from hundreds of other people's first dances, father-daughter dances, anniversary dances, the kinds of moments Ashford and Lane made pretty and then packed away. I told her I had spent years being allowed into rooms because I knew how to make myself useful. Useful men could stand near power as long as they carried something: a schedule, a toolkit, a solution. A kit, yes. But wanting the woman at the center of the room was different. Wanting her felt like stepping where I had not been invited. Vivian's eyes did not leave mine. "I'm inviting you," she said. The words were simple. That made them worse. I laughed once under my breath, not because it was funny, but because if I did not release something, I might say everything badly. I told her I wanted her. There it was. No polish, no safe phrasing, no professional distance. Just the sentence, heavy and alive between the shelves of retired decorations. Vivian went still. I kept going because stopping would have been cowardice dressed as restraint. I told her I had wanted her longer than was convenient and more than was wise. I had wanted her in meeting rooms when she removed her earrings and rubbed the bridge of her nose because clients had mistaken elegance for endless patience. I had wanted her when she corrected Graham in public with a smile sharp enough to draw blood. I had wanted her when she looked across the anniversary party and saw me before anyone needed me. And yes, I had wanted her during that dance so badly that counting steps was the only way I knew not to pull her closer. Vivian's face changed while I spoke. The anger did not vanish, but something under it opened. She said my name softly, and I almost lost the nerve I had just found. I told her that wanting her was not the part I was ashamed of. I was ashamed that I kept treating my own fear like it was protection for her. I was ashamed that Charles could say "good man," and I would automatically turn myself into the kind of good that made everyone comfortable except me. I was ashamed that when she asked me to stay on that dance floor, I had still been thinking about who might notice instead of what it meant that she asked. Vivian stepped close enough now that I could see the faint shadow beneath her eyes, the human tiredness under the perfect Ashford posture. She said, "I don't need you to know your place, Nolan. I need you to stop leaving it empty." I did not touch her right away. That mattered. The room was too charged, and I was too aware of how quickly truth could become another excuse for taking what had not been carefully chosen. But Vivian reached for my hand first. Her fingers slid into mine with a steadiness that made every argument in my head go quiet for one dangerous second. She looked down at our hands, then back at me, and said she was not asking me to save her from Graham, her father, or the company. She was asking whether I was brave enough to believe her when she said she knew what she wanted. I told her I was trying. She said trying was not the same as staying. That should have hurt. It did. But it also sounded fair. Behind us, the stacked dance floor panels reflected the warehouse lights in dull, broken strips. Vivian moved closer, and this time I did not step back. Her free hand rested lightly against my chest, not claiming, not demanding, just feeling the truth of me standing there. I could feel her breath. I could feel my own restraint shaking. She looked at my mouth, then smiled sadly, like she knew I was about to make this harder than it needed to be. I wanted to kiss her. Not almost, not theoretically. I wanted it with the kind of clarity that made every rule look thinner than paper. I lowered my head, and for one suspended second, there was no family company, no old engagement, no father's warning, no Graham, no ballroom full of people waiting to misunderstand. There was only Vivian, close enough to choose, and me, finally close enough to be chosen. Then I stopped, barely. Her eyes closed for half a breath before opening again, and the hurt there almost made me hate myself. I told her I wanted our first kiss to happen when neither of us was proving something to anyone, not to her father, not to Graham, not to me, not in a storage hallway after a fight, surrounded by old decorations and all the ghosts of performances she was trying to escape. Vivian's hand tightened once against mine, then relaxed. She looked disappointed. Yes, but not dismissed. That was the mercy of her. She could tell the difference between rejection and a man terrified of getting the first honest thing right. She stepped back, but only enough to let both of us breathe. For a moment, she looked past me at the stacked panels, and her expression settled into something calmer and more decisive than anger. She told me there was a client gala in 2 nights, the kind with sponsors, photographers, old money, and enough public pressure to make Charles forget he had a daughter instead of a brand asset. Graham would be there, Charles would expect her to behave. Everyone would expect the story to become elegant again. Then she looked at me. I'm done being escorted by men who only want me to look right, she said. So when I stop performing, Nolan, decide whether you're going to watch from the edge again. She left before I could answer, and for a long time I stood beside those retired dance floor panels, understanding that the next time Vivian reached for me, stepping back would not be respect. It would be a choice. The client gala 2 nights later looked exactly like the kind of evening Ashford and Lane was paid to make impossible to criticize. The waterfront ballroom had been transformed by candlelight, white orchids, polished glass, and the kind of soft gold lighting that made everyone look slightly richer and more forgiving than they probably were. I knew because I had checked the lighting myself twice, then pretended not to care when the photographer complimented it. Guests moved through the room with champagne in hand, sponsors laughed near the harbor windows, and Charles Ashford stood at the center of it all, looking like a man whose entire life had trained him to turn private discomfort into public elegance. I stood where I always stood, near the edge, headset in one ear, schedule folded in my jacket pocket, watching for problems before anyone else could notice them. Except this time, the problem was not a missing vendor or a crooked centerpiece. It was me trying to decide whether I was going to spend another night being the man Vivian had warned me about. I saw her before she saw me. Vivian stood near the main entrance in a black dress that made the room seem too loud around her. She was speaking with a sponsor's wife, smiling with perfect control, one hand resting lightly against her clutch. She looked calm, elegant, and entirely alone in a way most people would never catch. I caught it because I had learned her versions of silence by then. There was the silence she used when clients were being difficult, the silence she used when Charles managed her instead of hearing her, and the silence she used when she had already decided something and was waiting for the room to catch up. Tonight, she was wearing the third one. Across the ballroom, Graham Tate watched her like a man studying property he believed he still had a claim to. Charles watched both of them, and I watched Charles realize, slowly, that the graceful version of the evening he wanted was already slipping out of reach. For almost an hour, nothing happened loudly. That was how these rooms worked. Pressure moved through smiles, through tiny pauses, through who touched whose elbow and who looked away first. Graham approached Vivian twice. The first time, she gave him a polite answer and moved toward a group of clients. The second time, he made her laugh in front of 3 sponsors, but I knew Vivian's laugh well enough by then to know it had no warmth in it. I kept working because work gave my hands something to do while the rest of me burned. A caterer asked where the backup champagne was. A florist needed approval for moving to arrangements near the stage. The band leader checked whether the first dance set should begin before or after Charles's remarks. I answered everything correctly, professionally, uselessly. Then the band shifted into something slow, and Graham stepped into the open space before Vivian could move away. He did it beautifully. That was the infuriating part. He did not grab her or corner her like a villain in a cheap story. He offered his hand with a charming smile, just close enough to make refusing him look dramatic. Around them, people noticed. Charles noticed. I saw the old machinery turning in his face. Sponsors, photographs, reputation, no scene. Not tonight. Graham said something I could not hear, and Vivian's expression stayed pleasant, but her fingers tightened around her clutch. Charles moved toward her, not fast, not forceful, but with that father-host blend that made concern feel like stage direction. I was too far away to hear the first words, but I saw Charles gesture gently toward the dance floor. He was not trying to hurt her. That almost made it worse. He was trying to guide her back into a picture that made sense to everyone except the woman standing in it. My first instinct was to leave before I became the wrong answer to a question nobody had asked me out loud. I actually turned halfway toward the service door. I told myself I was doing it for her father, for the company, for the fragile piece of an expensive evening. The same old list, polished and cowardly. Then Vivian looked across the ballroom and found me. She did not plead. She did not signal for rescue. She simply looked at me as if the edge of the room was not far enough to make me invisible anymore. Graham's hand was still extended. Charles was waiting. The room was watching without admitting it. And I understood with terrible clarity that if I walked away now, I would not be protecting Vivian from gossip. I would be helping everyone else decide what her courage was allowed to mean. Vivian turned from Graham. She did not explain. She did not apologize. She walked across the floor toward me, and with every step, the room grew quieter in that hungry, expensive way rooms do when people sense a story-changing shape. I stood still, because moving suddenly felt like disrespecting the risk she was taking. When she reached me, she held out her hand. "Dance with me," she said, not loudly, but clearly enough that the nearest guests heard. I looked past her once, just once, at Charles. His face was stunned, hurt, worried, and proud in a way he probably did not understand yet. Graham's smile had gone flat. Someone near the bar whispered something. Vivian's hand did not shake. I took her hand. Graham laughed once under his breath, but the sound carried. He said something about me being good with logistics, not legacies, and a few people shifted uncomfortably because the insult had taken its gloves off. My grip tightened around Vivian's fingers. Not enough to hurt. Enough to tell her I had heard it and was still there. She stepped closer, ready to answer, but for once, I got there first. I looked at Graham only long enough to know I was done performing humility for men who mistook it for permission. Then I looked back at Vivian, because she was the only person in the room I needed to tell the truth to. I said I was tired of being safe enough for everyone except the woman I wanted. The words came out rougher than I expected, and the room seemed to hold its breath around them. Vivian's face changed, not into surprise, into recognition, as if she had been waiting for me to finally say the sentence in a room where it could not be hidden under work, timing, respect, or fear. Charles said my name from somewhere behind her, not sharply, but with warning. I heard him, I respected him, I even understood him, but I did not let go. Vivian turned her head toward her father and said, with a calm that belonged entirely to her, that she was done being protected from her own choices. She said she loved him, but she would not keep mistaking his comfort for her safety. Charles looked like the words had reached him slowly, then all at once. He did not approve. Not yet. But for the first time since I had known him, he did not try to turn the moment into an event problem I could solve. The band, God bless them, had no idea what to do, so they kept playing. Vivian stepped into my arms, and this time no one pushed me there. My hand found her back, the same place it had rested at the anniversary party, but nothing about it felt a sign now. I held her carefully, yes, but not distantly. There is a difference. Her hand settled on my shoulder, her fingers warmed through my jacket, and the first few steps were awkward because both of us were breathing like we had just escaped something. Then she smiled, small and private, and the whole ballroom lost some of its power. I told her she had terrible timing. She said, I had worse courage. I said I was improving under pressure. She said, don't make me praise you in public. I almost laughed, and somehow that made the dance feel real. We moved slowly beneath the gold lights while the room pretended to recover around us. Graham did not leave immediately. Men like Graham rarely understood when the scene was over, but he stopped mattering before the song did. Charles stood near the edge of the floor, watching his daughter not as a brand, not as a family asset, but as a woman he could no longer manage back into childhood. Maybe that hurt him. Maybe it needed to. Vivian's eyes stayed on mine. Near the end of the song, she leaned close, her voice softer than the music, and said, "You can let go now if you want." I thought about every time I had stepped back and called it respect, every room I had left empty, every feeling I had buried so no one else would have to feel uncomfortable. Then I held her a little closer and told her the truth. I don't want to. After the song ended, I expected the room to punish us immediately. That was how rooms like that worked, or at least how I had always believed they worked. You stepped out of line, and the silence collected around you like a bill, but nothing exploded. No sponsor fainted into the orchids. No client demanded a refund because the operations coordinator had forgotten his assigned level of invisibility. The band slid into another song. Conversations started again in careful little waves. And Vivian stayed beside me with her hands still in mine, as if letting go too quickly would turn the whole thing back into a performance. Graham disappeared first, which felt less like defeat and more like a man refusing to stay in a room where he no longer controlled the lighting. Charles remained near the edge of the floor, watching us with a face I could not read. For the first time since I had known him, he looked less like the founder of Ashford and Lane Events and more like a father who had just realized his daughter had been growing beyond his reach while he was busy arranging the room around her. I did not get fired that night. I know that sounds like a small detail, But in my head, it had been the first consequence, the obvious one, the neat professional punishment for confusing a company gala with the rest of my life. Instead, Charles asked to speak with me after the last guest left, and the crew began breaking down the room. Vivian started to follow, but he looked at her and said, gently, that he needed 5 minutes with me. She crossed her arms in that exact Ashford way that made employees straighten up and vendors reconsider their invoices. Then she said, "If this is about deciding what I meant, I'm staying." Charles looked tired when he answered. "No," he said. "I think I've done enough of that." That was not an apology, not fully, but it was the first crack in the wall, and Vivian heard it too. She looked at me, asking without asking if I was all right. I nodded, and for once, it did not feel like pretending. Charles and I stood near the harbor windows while the ballroom slowly lost its magic behind us. Linens came off tables, candles were blown out, the flowers were carried away in plastic tubs, and the chandeliers looked less romantic under cleanup lights. Charles kept his hands in his pockets and stared out at the dark water for a while before speaking. He told me he had trusted me for years because I knew how to keep difficult things from becoming messy. I said that was the job. He looked at me then and said maybe that was where he had been unfair. Maybe he had mistaken my discipline for a lack of wanting. That sentence hit harder than any warning he had given me. I did not know what to do with a powerful man admitting he had been wrong without trying to dress it up as strategy. He asked if I loved her, not like a boss, not like a man protecting company reputation, like a father who was afraid of the answer either way. I could have softened it. I could have said it was early, complicated, something we were figuring out carefully. All of that would have been true enough and useless. So I told him yes, or at least I was close enough to it that lying would only make me look safer. Charles closed his eyes for a second, then gave a tired laugh. He said Vivian had always hated being managed, even as a child. I said she had probably come by that honestly. That earned me a look, and then, to my surprise, a small smile. He told me he was not giving permission, because Vivian had made it painfully clear that permission was not his to give. But he was asking me not to make her smaller than I found her. I told him I would not. Then, because the night had already taken most of my hiding places, I added that I was also done making myself smaller just to look respectful. Charles nodded slowly, like that one cost him something to hear. Vivian was waiting in the empty ballroom when I came back. The crew had finished most of the teardown, and only a few floor lights remained, casting long gold lines across the polished wood. She had taken off her heels and stood barefoot near the center of the floor, her black dress brushing her ankles, her hair loosened from the night. She looked exhausted, relieved, and real in a way the gala had never allowed. "Am I about to be the reason operations loses its best coordinator?" she asked. I told her no, though I might be the reason her father started drinking stronger coffee. She smiled, but her eyes searched mine carefully. I crossed the floor toward her, and for once I did not stop at the edge. I told her Charles was learning. She said Charles preferred learning when it came with a printed agenda. I said I would draft one. She laughed then, soft and tired, and the sound made the entire empty room feel less expensive. There was no music anymore, just the muffled clatter of carts somewhere down the hall and the low hum of the building settling after a long night. I took out my phone and found the first slow song that would not embarrass me beyond recovery. Vivian's eyebrow lifted when the music started through the tiny speaker. "This is your grand romantic gesture?" she asked. I told her budgets were tight after the orchid situation. She stepped closer and placed her hand in mine, the same way she had at the anniversary party, but everything was different now. No father pushing me forward, no Graham watching, no room deciding what we were allowed to be. My hand found her back, and this time I did not hold her like an apology. I held her like a choice. We danced badly at first. That felt important. The public dance had looked smoother because both of us had been performing control. This one had awkward feet, quiet laughter, and one moment where Vivian nearly stepped on my shoe and blamed the floor. I told her I counted steps for a reason, and she said maybe I could stop counting long enough to enjoy being exactly where I was. So I tried. I stopped checking the doors. I stopped listening for problems. I stopped preparing to let go before anyone could ask me to stay. Vivian leaned her forehead lightly against my shoulder, and for several slow turns around that empty floor, neither of us said anything. The silence did not erase me. It held us. When she lifted her face, I knew the kiss was coming before it happened, and this time I did not step back to make it noble. I asked her anyway, because wanting her had never meant taking the choice out of her hands. She smiled at that, touched my jaw with her fingers, and said, "Nolan, if you ask me any more respectfully, I may lose patience." So I kissed her. It was quiet, warm, and steady, the kind of kiss that did not feel stolen from a hallway or forced by a jealous room. It felt chosen in the aftermath, after the lights dimmed, after the audience left, after every excuse had been given a chance and failed. When we pulled apart, she whispered, "You didn't let go." I looked at my hand, at her back, then back at her. "I'm learning," I said. That was how it really began. Not with Charles making me dance with his daughter, not with Graham's insult, not even with Vivian whispering for me not to let go in front of half the company. It began in the empty room afterward, when nobody needed anything from me and she still wanted me there. I used to think knowing my place meant respecting everyone else's boundaries. Vivian taught me that sometimes your place is just the corner fear picked for you before love ever got a vote. And sometimes the bravest thing a good man can do is stop stepping back from the woman who is reaching for him. So tell me, have you ever stepped away from someone you wanted because you thought it was not your place? Was it really respect, or was it fear wearing a better suit? Share your story in the comments. If this one stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.
Bye-bye.